Hey guys, we're going to talk about Isaiah 40 to 66 today. What some call second Isaiah, or later Isaiah, Deutero Isaiah. We're just going to call it Isaiah, but just know that there's lots of different ways people look at this. These chapters of Isaiah are kind of a different set of texts. These words are essentially saying to Israel after they've messed up that it's going to be okay. And so if you look in Isaiah 40, from the right out of the gate, there's this message that, that they're going to be comforted. Look what it says in verse 1. Comfort ye, my people, saith your God. Speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem, and cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished. So that means her time of service. To the Jews at the time, probably it meant the exile. They're going to be out of exile. That's why, this is one of the reasons why in scholarship some say, hey, some of this stuff may have been written after the exile by followers of Isaiah to comfort the exiles and tell them, okay, now what? Now that our temple's been destroyed, we've been in exile for 70 years and we're coming back to Jerusalem. How does our relationship with God matter? It's almost as if, if you're teaching a group of, say, teenagers and you're to talk to them about morality, there's a group that you want to say, hey, don't mess up. But then you want to send hope to those that have. And so Isaiah 40 through 66 is kind of that message of, okay, now that things have gone wrong, now what? Is there any hope for me? But Isaiah 1 through 39 is essentially, hey, don't mess up. And so that's kind of the overarching theme of what's happening here. But Isaiah, as a seer, could have easily given these prophecies. They also could have been given orally and then later written down. Another thought is that Isaiah 40 through 66, to me, this is a strong evidence for why Isaiah 40 through 66 was written by the actual Isaiah, son of Amos, in 740 BC, is because in these texts, in these chapters 40 through 66, this is all First Temple literature. This is what's called the festal drama of First Temple Israelite religion. And essentially what it was, if you've been in doubt, it was like a big drawn out endowment. It was essentially where the king and his queen would make covenants with God and everybody would be witnesses. And then as the king and queen tied themselves to deity through covenants in this ritual drama setting, as they did this, then the audience would as well. They would make covenants to God as if they were the king and the queen. And in the midst of this multi-day ceremony, there was a drama portrayed. The king would be ritually humiliated, and then he would be enthroned. In the ancient Near East, this was a yearly thing that happened, and it wasn't just the Jews who would do this. Today, we have elections in a lot of our democratic nations. Every 4 years, the king or the president has to prove his or her worth and get elected, as it were. Well, in the ancient Near East, the king would be ritually humiliated in front of everyone. He would be stripped of his robes of kingship and would be humiliated by the priest and would confess his allegiance to God. And even if he shed tears, it would be a sign that things were good and that he was a good king. This is a book that's written by J.H. Eaton called The Festal Drama in Deutero Isaiah. And he says this: since the Davidic kingship is certainly comparable with that of surrounding nations in respect to its ideology and some of its ceremonies, the question arises as to whether such comparability applies to the scenes of humiliation in the festival. The most clearly known royal humiliation is that of the Babylonian king in the New Year festival. On the 5th day, the tablets relate, he came before the state god Marduk, his royal insignia were removed and deposited before the god. He was dragged on his knees before the god and beaten about the head. He recited a statement claiming to have ruled righteously as the god required. Eventually, the god declared his pleasure in the king and promised him blessing and victory. The king was then reinvested. Again, he was struck, and any resultant tears being taken as a good omen. A full assessment of the significance of this ceremony is hampered by the fact that the tablets covering the central days of the 11-day festival have not survived, while those that we have are sparing of explanation. But some points are clear. The king had to relinquish the symbols of his office and receive them anew from the god as he had received them at his first enthronement. Yet he was not just brought down to the status of a commoner. He was ill-treated and beaten. Is this a penitential role, a punishment for faults in him or in society? This aspect is not elucidated in the text. Clearly, this rite showed that the God was the source of kingship, and that the king emerged from the ordeal with renewed legitimation. He was now fit to conduct the culminating ceremonies of the festival, where the god's mighty triumph over the forces of chaos was reenacted. I see this as part of the festival where the king would be humiliated, and then he would be re-enthroned. I also think this is a type of Christ, where we read in some of the Isaiah texts where this servant suffers and goes down into the depths, but then he's put on the throne. And we see this with Jesus in Isaiah 53, but we also see this with Israel, where she's humiliated and then she's put back on the throne. And so that's so important to understand, that if we read Isaiah 40 through 66 and we understand a little bit about the pre-exilic festival, is what I'm going to call it, this festal drama that took a multitude of days, and it was symbolic of the king and queen being married and making covenants with Yahweh. And then as they did this, the Israelites participated in this. It was as if they were the king and queen. And so this is also kind of laid out in Mosiah 1 through 6. This is the same time period, and it's the same festal drama going on. And in this case, we have Benjamin transferring the rights and authority of kingship to his son, Mosiah. And he stands up and says, and he's not humiliated, but he stands up and says, hey, I became a commoner. I worked. I lowered myself to serve you guys. And because I did that, I was a true king. And then what does he do in the heart of Mosiah 1 through 6? In chapters 3 and 4, he says, your heavenly king, Yahweh, is going to come down and be humiliated. He's going to be scourged and smitten and slain, and he's going to die. And then because of this, you will be made free. And so what do? They all make covenants with God collectively. And essentially, as King Benjamin says, I'm tying myself to God, they tie themselves to God as well, and they receive a new name. And all of this stuff is in Isaiah. I think this is one of the reasons why Jesus says, hey, we might want to read the words of Isaiah. And so Isaiah 40 is comfort my people, comfort them. And he says some things that are interesting here, where he said, look in verse 17 and look in verse 15. He says, the nations are as a drop in the bucket, or all nations before him are as nothing. And so what he's trying to do is to show the Israelites that even though you've been wrecked, or even though you've been rejected, God will feed you, verse 11, like a shepherd. He'll gather the lambs with his arm and gently lead them, and those that are young. I love verse 12 of Isaiah 40. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and meted out heaven with the span, and comprehended the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance? So essentially what he's saying here is, you guys are going to be okay. I'm in charge, and I've got your back. And the nations that you think are so great, not so much. Notice what he says in verse 18, to whom will you liken God? Over and over again, he asks that question, like, what are we going to liken God to? For example, look in 46:5 of Isaiah, 46:5. To whom will you liken me and make me equal and compare me that we may be like? And then Isaiah 46:6 says, they lavish gold out of the bag, they weigh silver in the balance, and hire a goldsmith, and he maketh it a god, and they fall down and worship it. This is the height of irony, and it's going to happen over and over again in Isaiah, where he says, who are you going to liken me to? And his answer, it's a rhetorical question. His answer is, you can't liken me to anything, but you guys keep trying to make idols. So if you go back to chapter 40, when he says, who are you going to liken me? And then the very next verse, after verse 18, where he asks the question, look in verse 19. The workman melteth a graven image. So you're back to idol worshiping again. He's like, you're doing it wrong. And so he's over and over again going to ask that question. Look in verse 25 of Isaiah 40. To whom will you liken me? Or shall I be equal, saith the Holy One? And that's the question. And the answer is, well, obviously, nobody. Look at the end of verse 28. There is no searching of his understanding. And then the promise in verse 31. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. And so that's the message. Like, I'm going to deliver you. By the way, I have to get a little nerdy here. I'm showing my youngest son Lord of the Rings over this COVID quarantine week 4 situation. And at the end of Lord of the Rings, obviously the eagles save him. And I don't think that was, just a coincidence. I think Tolkien's using that image right out of Isaiah, saying, hey, these young hobbits that save the world from evil are mounting literally eagles as they run and escape the evil. So Isaiah 41 kind of starts off with, this message of being courageous. If you look in verse 6 and 7, there's this satire, kind of a mocking of idol making. Be of good courage, verse 6. The carpenter encouraged the goldsmith, and he that smootheth with the hammer, him that smote the anvil, saying, it is ready for this soldering. And he fastened it with nails, that it should not be moved. This is kind of a mocking of making idols, and it's in a satirical style. You see this in lots of places in Isaiah. For example, 42:17 kind of says some of the same stuff. They may be turned back that shall be greatly ashamed, that trust in graven images, that saith to the molten images, ye are our gods. And these followers are going to be called deaf and blind people. In the 44th chapter of Isaiah, we see this in verses 9 through 20. Just this mocking of making gods and how they're going to be ashamed and they're going to be faint and they don't know anything. Verse 18, they don't understand. Just a constant mocking of these people that make idols. And so Isaiah is certainly not politically correct. Like, he's just coming out and blasting what he deems as, stupid stuff. So 45, kind of the same thing in 16 and 17. It talks about that, they're going to be in confusion. The word a lot of times for this is going to be tohu, which is this utter chaos. This following idols is just really not smart. We see this in the 46th chapter in the first couple of verses. Bel boweth down and Nebo stoopeth. We'll kind of talk about that later when we get to 46. But this is a big deal to Isaiah, this just mockery of idols. But after he's done mocking those people that are involved in it, the rest of this chapter is a message of hope. So just a couple things. Look at verse 10 of Isaiah 41. Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee, yea, I will help thee. I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness. It's almost like you can hear the song, fear not, I am with thee, O be not dismayed, for I am thy God, and will still give thee aid. I'll strengthen thee, help thee, and cause thee to stand, upheld by thy righteous omnipotent hand. You can kind of see this here. He talks about the end of verse 17, I'm not going to forsake you. I will open rivers in high places and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water and the dry land springs of water. Verse 18. And then verse 20, that they may see and know and consider and understand together that the hand of the Lord has done this. The Holy One of Israel created it. And so that's his overarching message in the 41st chapter, is this message of hope and this message of, coming into God and seeing the right way. 42, 1 through 4 begins a series of visions, or what are called songs. These are going to be called the servant songs, and there's essentially 4 of them in Isaiah. So 42, 1 through 4 is the first servant song. 49, 1 through 6 is the second. 54 through 11 is the third. And 52, verse 13 to 53, 12 is going to be the fourth servant song. And so typically when I teach this in a classroom setting, we just kind of go through the servant songs and we read them. A lot of times I'll have students read them to themselves, and then we'll get together and talk about it and say, okay, would you see Jesus here anywhere in this servant song? And so just know there's lots of different ways that people interpret the servant songs. Because I love Jesus, am obviously going to see Jesus all through these servant songs. But know that from a Jewish perspective, they're certainly not looking at this as Jesus. They have different interpretations. But I'm going to read 42, 1 through 4. Behold my servant whom I uphold, mine elect, in whom my soul delighteth. I have put my spirit upon him, and he shall bring forth judgment to the Gentiles. Judgment or fairness. We're bringing fairness to the earth. He shall not cry nor lift up, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. A bruised reed shall he not break, and the smoking flax shall he not quench. He shall bring forth judgment unto truth. He shall not fail nor be discouraged till he has set judgment in the earth, and the isles shall wait for his law. And so my reading of this is Jesus as the Messiah is going to establish a world that is fair. He's going to establish a place where we can be free, where we can be happy. Notice verse 7, to open the blind eyes, to bring out the prisoners from the prison, and them that sit in darkness out of the prison house. I am the Lord, that is my name, and my glory will I not give to another. And so that's one way to read it, that we're going to have this complete fairness. And the Jews did look forward to this. They looked forward to a Messiah who would be fair. And Messiah, remember, is anointed one. It's one who is anointed to be king, and he's going to bring fairness. As far as the bruised reed and the smoking flax in verse 3, there's lots of different interpretations. I kind of like the idea that the crushed reed and the smoldering wick represent the oppressed and the needy, and that they have a reference especially to the sufferings of the Jews in the exile. In other words, this king is going to be so gentle. There's lots of different interpretations on Isaiah 40, verse 3, but that's one of them, and I like that one. Okay, let's do the second servant song in 49, 1 through 6. So 49, 1 through 6 says this. Listen, O isles, unto me, and hearken, my people from afar. The Lord has called me from the womb, and from the bowels of my mother hath he made mention of my name. And he has made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand hath he hid me, and made me a polished shaft. In his quiver hath he hid me. And he said unto me, Thou art my servant, O Israel, in whom I will be glorified. And then I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing, or for naught, and in vain. Yet surely my judgment is with the Lord, and my work with my God. And now saith the Lord, that formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob again to him, though Israel be not gathered. Yet shall I be glorious in the eyes of the Lord, and my God shall be my strength. And he said, It is a light thing that thou shouldst be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and to restore the preserved of Israel. I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be my salvation unto the ends of the earth. And so there's a lot happening here, but I like reading this as Christ, selected from birth in the pre-earth life, hidden in the Lord's hand, verse 2, like a polished shaft. Jesus learned obedience in all things that he suffered. He was like a polished shaft, Hebrews 5, 8 and 9, or 3 Nephi 12, 48. He was made perfect. Sometimes he may have felt that he labored in vain. Jesus was rejected by his own people, John 1, verse 11. We also read that in John 6. He'll be involved in the gathering of Israel. You've got all kinds of scriptures talking about Jesus being involved in the gathering of Israel. And so even though Israel wasn't gathered in his day, Jesus is involved in the gathering. I mean, you've got 3 Nephi 15, 11 through 24, Matthew 23, 37, the famous one, John 10, 16, other sheep I have which are not of this fold. You've got the end of Jacob 5, 50 through 53, where he's working with the servants in the vineyard, gathering Israel. You can also see this whole servant passage as a representation of you. You are the servant in these verses. So, for example, you've been selected before you were born. You're hidden in the Lord's hand, verse 2. You're like a polished shaft. You have to go through suffering and learning and those kinds of things to be polished. Sometimes you may feel like you've labored in vain. I know that there's many ways that, when we serve the Lord, sometimes we're like, well, is it even worth it? Is anyone even listening? If you've been on a mission, you may have had times when you're like, this is so hard. Like no one's listening, or they're not changing their life. Or maybe in your life, your own life, as you've tried to follow Jesus, you're like, this is so hard. It seems like it's in vain. This is such a challenge. And then finally, you're involved in the gathering of Israel in verse 5 and 6. You are to be a restorer or a light to the Gentiles. And so I really like 49 as a message of Jesus, but also as a message of anyone who covenants to follow the Lord and wants to bring Zion. This is Joseph Smith in all of these verses. We can read Joseph Smith in there as well. So that's 49. In the 50th chapter of Isaiah, we read this. This is the third servant song, verses 4 through 11. The Lord has given me the tongue of the learned, that I should know how to speak a word in season to him that is weary. He wakeneth morning by morning. He wakeneth mine ear to hear as the learned. The Lord God has opened mine ear, and I was not rebellious, neither turned away back. I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from shame and spitting. And then there's more. But verse 5 to me really is, I'm just honing in on that. That's really, to me, Jesus, where it says, I was not rebellious, neither turned away my back. I mean, Jeremiah has moments of rebellion. Moses has moments when he murmurs. Even Lehi in the Book of Mormon. In a lot of the prophetic narratives, prophets are people. And so verse 5, if we're going to take it all the way there, I think that's got to be Jesus. In the 52nd chapter, the fourth servant song, 52:13 all the way to the end of 53, this is the biggest servant song in Isaiah. And this is really just money scripture. This is scripture that, most of this kind of stuff got edited out. For example, the text in 1 Nephi 19, right, about the God of the Old Testament who was to die. I mean, this stuff gets edited out. 1 Nephi 19:10, I mean, this kind of stuff gets edited right out of the Bible. The God of our fathers who was led out of Egypt, out of bondage, and also were preserved in the wilderness by him. Yea, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob yieldeth himself, according to the words of the angel, as a man into the hands of the wicked men, to be lifted up according to the words of Enoch, and to be crucified according to the words of Neum, and to be buried in a sepulchre according to the words of Zenos, which he spake concerning the 3 days of darkness, which should be a sign given of his death unto those who should inhabit the isles of the sea, more especially given unto those who are of the house of Israel. I mean, you just don't read stuff like this in the Bible. And so it's amazing to me that Isaiah 52 and 53 didn't get the axe of the editors, because so much of the Bible did. But yet there are verses in here, there's parts in these texts that are just a little bit changed. So, for example, take a good look at Isaiah 52:13. Behold, my servant, so this is the servant song, shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. As many as were astonished at thee, his visage was so marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. That is a really good Christian reading, how Jesus was marred. He was whipped. He was scourged. Margaret Barker has done some work on this where she says maybe that word was anointed and then it was changed by editors. In other words, he was anointed more than any man. In other words, he is King of Kings. So that's another way to look at this. Now, have the text been altered? Well, Joseph Smith seems to think so. If you look in verse 15, it says, so shall he sprinkle many nations, the kings shall shut their mouths at him. And Joseph changes that word to gather. The word nazah in the text is actually sprinkle. And so, what do we do with this? Like I said, I like Joseph's rendition where he changes it that he's going to gather Israel. But in the text, it does say sprinkle. Some translations say that he will startle many nations, which isn't the word, but that's some translations. It's kind of difficult. There are many scholars that say, maybe the original meaning Hebrew was something else. One author writes, the picture fits well. The servant is elsewhere said to have a mission to the nations, to be himself the covenant of people, and to save the multitudes from their sins, ritual terms being used. Here then he sprinkles nations either to cleanse them from their sins, or to conclude them in a covenant with Yahweh, or indeed both. Purification and conclusion of covenant were the appropriate work of the royal rulers of the peoples. In Mesopotamia, purification priest is one of the titles of the king. The immediate parallelism is thus: so will he sprinkle many nations, before him kings shall stop their mouths. The point is that his sprinkling is the work of the supreme authority, and the kings of the nations accept their subordination. I like that. That's J.H. Eaton's interpretation from the book Festal Drama in Deutero-Isaiah. And that is on page 76. So that's one of those, difficult verses as far as the servant song, sprinkle, gather. What is he doing? He is King of Kings. And then we get to the quotation of Abinadi, which is Isaiah 53, the great servant song, which is the continuation of the end of 52. And this is just so good. So I'm just going to read this. Who has believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid as it were our faces from him, and he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. And we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment. And who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. He made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, because he has done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him, he hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, and shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied by his knowledge. Shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he hath poured out his soul unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. And so that is Isaiah 53. So much in here, is just Jesus all the way. With his stripes we are healed, smitten of God and afflicted. He's borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. You have Alma 7:11 in there. You've got so much. And, when his soul shall be made an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. In verse 10, several of the general authorities have talked about how Jesus was strengthened when he suffered by seeing his seed. And Abinadi is going to say in the 14th and 15th and 16th chapters, he's going to say that the seed is anyone who follows Christ, anyone who believes in the prophets. And so, I can't read Isaiah 53 in any other way. It's a beautiful servant song testifying of Jesus and who he is. Even down to some of the details of like making his grave with the wicked and the rich in his death, and justifying many by his offering. To some Jews, they do view Isaiah 53 as the Jewish people, the Jewish nation. In other words, if we were Jewish and we were living in somewhere in Israel right now, we would say, well, the reason why we're here in Israel is because our ancestors have suffered, and they've paid a heavy price. And because of their price that they paid, we're here. And that's certainly an interpretation. I don't know if I would go with this all the way. For example, did they suffer for my sins? Some may view that in verse 10. I clearly like the Christian reading here. I can't but read this whole section as Jesus. Notice verse 2, he shall grow up before him as a tender plant and as a root out of dry ground. Comparison of kings generally with trees and shoots is pretty much everywhere in the Old Testament. We see some of this, for example, in Isaiah 11, 1 and 10. We see this in Jeremiah 23:5 and 33:15, Zechariah 3:8 and 6:12. These depictions of a king as a tree is pretty common stuff. In 1 Nephi 8, you approach the tree, and could that be the mother character? Could that be the king? I think it all fits. It's royal and its divinity. Also, I have to just geek out on Return of the King with Lord of the Rings. The king has the tree on his chest, and he claims the right as Isildur's heir to take over Middle Earth, and he does it through the Fessel drama. He does it through combat with the darkness. He is humiliated in many places. He's humiliated. Aragorn has to go through all kinds of things, like just being considered like a ranger, like nothing. People are always insulting him. But then eventually he defeats the darkness. He's enthroned. And obviously they don't totally do it in the movie, but Arwen comes to him and, in my mind, they're married. Aragorn and Arwen marry, and he establishes his throne. And that's kind of like, I'm giving it away, but if you haven't seen Return of the King, I pretty much blame you. You need to repent and watch Lord of the Rings. Good movies. But that whole depiction of the king overcoming the chaos, defeating the darkness, and being enthroned and being married is the Fessel drama. And this is what's going on in Isaiah. So Isaiah 53 is the humiliation of this tree. A root out of dry ground that has no form or comeliness, no beauty, and he's despised and he's rejected of men. And this whole text of Isaiah 53 is the humiliation of the king in the ancient Near East, but he is going to be enthroned. And so really cool stuff happening here in the servant songs. And so those are the 4 servant songs. So to recap, Isaiah 42, 1 through 4, Isaiah 49, 1 through 6, Isaiah 54 through 11, and Isaiah 52, 13 to the end of Isaiah 53. Those are the servant songs. So going back to 42, you've got the deaf and the blind being restored to their rightful place. The people in prison in verse 22, they're restored, and God is going to put everything back. And so that's essentially what's going on. Notice verse 16 of 42. He says, the crooked things are going to be made straight, and he's going to lead them in these paths. And that's a constant theme throughout the second portion of Isaiah. So go back and look at 40 verse 3. 40 verse 3 says, the voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, and make straight in the desert a highway for our God. And so we see it again in 42, but we also see it in 45. 45:2 says, I will go before thee and make the crooked places straight, and I will break in pieces the gates of brass. We see this also in 49:11. And the New Testament authors are going to pick up this too. They're going to pick up this baton and talk about it. Look in 49:11. I will make all my mountains a way, and my highways shall be exalted. And so the idea of making rough places smooth, exalting the valleys, and bringing down the mountains, I look at this big picture as Isaiah's message of redemption, and that the God of Israel is going to make rough places smooth. He's going to make crooked places straight. He's going to make it so that we can be reconciled with God and with our loved ones, that through Christ we can be healed, we can be whole. And that to me is what crooked places being made straight is, and valleys being filled. So there's more in this in the 43rd chapter of Isaiah. Lots of the Exodus motif is going on. For example, if you look in verse 15 of chapter 43, I am the Lord, your Holy One, and the Creator of Israel, your King. Thus saith the Lord, which maketh a way in the sea, and a path in the mighty waters, which bringeth forth the chariot, and the horse, and the army, and the power. They shall lie down together, they shall not rise. They are extinct. They are quenched as tow. And so that message is essentially that God is the God of the Exodus, and there's nobody like God. And that's verse 11. There's nobody besides me. There is no Savior. And this is a common theme that he's going to hit over and over again. Lots of themes also in verse 5 of, don't fear, I'm with you. I'm going to take care of you. Verse 26, if you put me in remembrance, then we'll plead together, and I'll be with you. I really think a lot of Isaiah is also very much similar to the book of Revelation, and somewhat to somewhat to Nephi's message in First Nephi. Nephi sees the last days, and he says, there's a lot of things I can't write, but John will write them. And John sees a lot of these things, and I believe so does Isaiah. So, for example, if you look in verse 8 and 9 of chapter 44, fear not, neither be afraid. Have I not told thee from time to time, and has declared it? Ye are even my witnesses. Is there a God besides me? There is no God. I know not any that make a graven image. All of them are vanity, and their delectable things shall not profit. They are their own witnesses, and they see not nor know, and that they may be ashamed. Who has formed a god or molten a graven image that is profitable for nothing? And over again, he says, they're going to be ashamed. In verse 11, verse 12 it's this huge edict against idolatry. It just goes on and on. 12 all the way to 18. Over and over again, it just says that they're going to, this idolatry doesn't work. And it's in verse 9, he calls them these delectable things. In Revelation 18:14, John is going to call this the dainties. And so much of a culture anciently was involved in totally encapsulating this idea of making idols and being involved in things that didn't matter. And so much of economies today are in these things that maybe don't have as much meaning, but it's just part of living in the culture, being human. We get involved in the thick of thin things. And so it's going to collapse. And so John in Revelation says, it's going to happen in one day. And we'll see this later in Isaiah's writing. Later when Isaiah just rails on Babylon in the 47th chapter, it's the great exchange. Isaiah 52 and 47, those two chapters kind of have to be read in conjunction with each other, because in 47, Babylon's kicked off the throne, and in 52, Israel's put on the throne. And so in 47, it talks about Babylon being kicked off. And notice what it says in verse 9. It says, these two things shall come to thee in a moment, in one day, the loss of children and widowhood. They shall come upon thee in their perfection, for the multitude of thy sorceries and for thy great abundance of thine enchantments. And we see this in Revelation 18:17 through 24, where John says it just collapses in one day. And John talks a lot about sorcery as well. And that word sorcery isn't, Harry Potter. It's, it's not witches and warlocks in movies or books. Sorcery is pharmakia. And my reading of that word is, the drug trade, the drug cartel. I mean, what's a bigger problem today? Illicit drugs, or watching Harry Potter or reading Harry Potter books. And so this loss of this culture that's just entrenched in the dainties, or in the delicacies, as Isaiah is going to call them, and it will fall in one day, or the delectable things. And so the 44th chapter of Isaiah is this shame, it's this collapse. We'll see this again in the 47th chapter. And I read this and I just see, it's amazing to me, in the words of, I think it was Elder Holland, where he said, something smaller than a grain of sand is crippling economies. And so Isaiah sees this, John sees this, and it's just interesting to me as I read this and I say, okay, well, what's the answer? What's the solution? And it's going to be, coming to the Lord and submitting to who he is. And that kind of really introduces the 45th chapter of Isaiah. And this is the prophecy of Cyrus. And Cyrus is a guy that is a Persian, and he doesn't live in Isaiah's time period. And so we have the 45th chapter of Isaiah, and a lot of scholars really struggle with this, because they're like, how would this have any relevance to Isaiah's audience? Because Isaiah lived in 740 BC, and Cyrus is going to come around at the end of the 600s. So right around, 550, 540 BC, Cyrus is going to become a big deal, and he's going to conquer the Babylonian Empire. He's going to get into Babylon. He's going to divert the water from the city and basically get in a secret way into the city of Babylon, take over. He's going to liberate the Jews, and he's going to send them back to their land. And he basically tells people, hey, go worship your God. And so in the 45th chapter of Isaiah, Cyrus is literally called the Mashiach. That's right there in verse 1. Look what it says. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him. I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. I will go before thee, and I will make, here it is again, crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron. And I will give thee the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that thou mayest know that I, the Lord, which call thee by thy name, am the God of Israel. For Jacob my servant's sake, and Israel mine elect, I have even called thee by thy name. I have surnamed thee, though thou hast not known me. I am the Lord, and there is none else. There is no God beside me. I girded thee, though thou hast not known me. So he gets all these symbols of kingship, right? He's going to get a name. He's going to get sacred vestments. He's going to be called the Anointed One. The Lord's going to take him by the right hand. All of this stuff's going on here in Isaiah 45, talking about Cyrus. And then the Lord said, in the Hebrew is Koresh. If you've ever heard of David Koresh, it's coming out of this idea. So Koresh in the Hebrew, but as English speakers, we call him Cyrus. Notice verse 13. I have raised him up in righteousness, and I will direct all his ways, and he'll build my city, and he will let go my captives, not for price nor reward, saith the Lord of hosts. And so this prophecy about Cyrus is a big deal. Now, just know that in scholarship, there's a huge contention that Isaiah didn't write this, that this was all written after the exile. And so it's what's called ex eventu prophecy, which just means a prophecy that was written after it came to pass to kind of validate Isaiah. I certainly don't believe that, but I understand the arguments in scholarship. That being said, I want to share this quote by Josephus, an ancient historian. So this is Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, Book 11, Chapter 1. And Josephus was a historian that lived between, 37 and 100 AD, so first century. And he was Jewish, but he was a servant of the Roman Empire and wrote a lot of histories. And this is what he says. He says, in the first year of the reign of Cyrus, which was the 70th from the day that our people were removed out of their own land into Babylon, God commiserated the captivity and calamity of these poor people, for he stirred up the mind of Cyrus and made him write this throughout all of Asia. Thus saith Cyrus the king, since God Almighty has appointed me to be the king of the habitable earth, I believe that he is that God which the nation of the Israelites worship. For indeed he foretold my name by the prophets, and that I should build him a house at Jerusalem in the country of Judea. This was known to Cyrus by his reading the book which Isaiah left behind him in his prophecies. For this prophet said that God had spoken thus to him in a secret vision. My will is that Cyrus, whom I have appointed to be king over many and great nations, send back my people to their own land and build my temple. This was foretold by Isaiah 140 years before the temple was demolished. Accordingly, when Cyrus read this and admired the divine power, an earnest desire and ambition seized upon him to fulfill what was so written. Josephus. And so in this text of Josephus's writings, he's essentially saying, hey, the prophecy of Isaiah was inspiring to Josephus. It caused him to want to send them back. I certainly like that. None of this is provable. We just don't know. The earliest Isaiah scroll we have is from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And, that doesn't date to 740 BC, but it's the oldest that we have. And this is called the Great Isaiah Scroll. I think I talked about it on one of our earlier podcasts, but it's dated somewhere between 356 and 100 BC. So it's not quite 740, but the earliest one we have is unified. It's got all 66 chapters in there. So however you want to take this, I'm going to read it as, hey, Isaiah called Cyrus by name. And, that's just how I'm going to read it. Notice what it says at the end of 44. That saith Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. And so anyway, however you want to read this, historically, Cyrus does this. He sends the Jews back, tells them, go ahead and rebuild your temple. And so the 45th chapter is this prophecy of him, and that God is going to do it. It's God that's working in Cyrus. In verse 13 of 45, it says, I've raised him up in righteousness. I will direct his ways. I am the Lord, verse 18, and there is none else. So what do I want you to do? Verse 20, assemble yourselves and come and draw near, ye that have escaped of the nations. And then look to me, verse 22. And verse 23, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall swear. That might remind you of some things that Paul says. And so that's Isaiah 45, this prophecy of this new king that's going to come and send the Jews back to rebuild their temple. And with that, we're going to pause and we'll do more next time. And thanks for listening, you guys. And hopefully you're doing well. I hope that you guys are well. And I hope you liked conference. And I'm thinking about you. And I'm sorry that we're not doing more of these. I'm trying to get them out, but it's a process. And I want to make them good. So thanks for your patience.